The bomber came home on fire. Its left wing was shredded, the fuselage pocked with holes the size of fists, the glass of the nose turret spiderwebbed and glinting red in the fading sun. Engines 3 and 4 were coughing black smoke, their propellers uneven and shaking. Every man on the ground at Thorpe Abbott stopped what he was doing when they saw her limp across the sky. The control tower called her a ghost, a B-17 that should have fallen 50 miles back over Bremen. But she was still flying. The tower operator counted the holes through binoculars. 17 visible impacts, 3 from cannon shells that should have split the fuselage in half. And yet the bomber stayed level, flaps down, descending in a slow, stubborn glide that refused to end. The wheels touched the runway, bounced once, and somehow held. When she rolled to a stop, steam hissed from ruptured coolant lines, and one of the gunners climbed out through a hole that hadn't existed that morning. His face was blackened with soot, his jacket torn. When the medics ran to pull the crew out, they saw something that made them freeze. The floor of the waist section, the belly that usually gave way under fire, was plated with crude hand-cut armor. Sections of steel sheet, uneven and riveted by hand, covered the thin aluminum skin. The gunner's position had been lined with welded truck doors, the ball turret shielded by what looked like old boiler panels. None of it was regulation. All of it was ugly, and all of it had worked. The squadron commander stormed across the tarmac, furious and confused. "Who did this?" he shouted. "Who authorized this modification?" The crew chief, hands black with oil and eyes half dead from exhaustion, just shrugged. "Nobody authorized it, sir. But we're alive, aren't we?" The commander stared at the steel plates, the ragged weld seams, the holes burned through the paint. Beneath the grime, someone had stenciled a crude name on the side in red primer: Iron Belle. The name spread like wildfire through the base. The story, too. A bomber that took 17 hits and came home because a mechanic refused to trust factory armor. By nightfall, ground crews from other squadrons were sneaking into the hangar just to touch it, to see the proof that improvisation had beaten engineering. The myth started that day. One wrench, one man, one illegal idea. A mechanic who had taken a crippled bomber and turned it into a flying tank. Before the war, engineers at Boeing swore that perfection could be designed. The B-17 Flying Fortress was the embodiment of that belief, a symphony of precision, a machine built not to improvise but to endure. Every rivet was calculated, every bolt load-tested, every curve refined in wind tunnels until it whispered efficiency. The manuals called it invincible. The pilots called it beautiful. The crews called it home. But war had a way of breaking beautiful things. The engineers back in Seattle had never seen what 20mm cannon shells did to a bomber's belly at 25,000 feet. They'd never heard the sound of flak punching through aluminum, or the scream of a gunner trapped in a turret as hydraulic fluid poured over his boots. They built for stability, not survival. Out in England, men like Ray Keller, field mechanics, wrench-swinging magicians of the mud, saw a different reality. They watched brand-new B-17s arrive straight from the States, gleaming silver, polished like trophies. And within 2 missions, they came back leaking smoke, half their fuselage peeled like tin. Factory perfection didn't matter when the enemy aimed for the one spot the blueprints forgot: the soft underbelly, the unarmored waist, the crew compartments thin as soda cans. That's where the myth of perfection died. Not in design rooms, but in the freezing contrails over Bremen and Schweinfurt. Every mechanic on those bases knew the truth. The bomber was strong, yes, but strong in theory. In practice, it was fragile in the exact places that mattered most, and fixing that wasn't in the manual. The rules forbade altering the structure. Mechanics were to maintain to specification, not redesign. But to men like Keller, those words meant death sentences for the crews they watched climb aboard. He'd seen too many planes written off because a technician was afraid to think. Too many gunners buried because steel had been weighed against efficiency. The misconception wasn't just mechanical, it was cultural. The Army trusted engineers, not improvisers. Precision was worshipped. Ingenuity was tolerated. Innovation, unless it came stamped with approval, was called insubordination. Keller had spent months fixing bullet holes, replacing hydraulic lines, and watching the same weak spots get hit again and again. The lower fuselage, the ammo feed chute, the gunner's seat. One night, after yet another B-17 returned in flames with the waist gunner dead from a single cannon round through the floor, Keller snapped. He threw his wrench across the hangar and said, "If they won't armor it, I will." The other mechanics laughed at first. Armor weighed too much, they said. It would mess with balance, ruin lift, strain the wings. Keller didn't care. He wasn't designing a bomber anymore. He was trying to keep men alive long enough to land. The difference between regulation and reality was the distance between a drafting table and a smoking crater. Perfection belonged to engineers. Survival belonged to men with dirty hands and a torch. And the next B-17 that came limping back full of holes, that's where Keller decided perfection could go to hell. He was going to build something uglier, heavier, slower. But it would never die pretty. By the middle of 1943, Europe had become an open furnace for bomber crews. The daylight raids that American commanders swore would crush Germany's industry in months were instead crushing their own men. Every morning, the airfields of the 8th Air Force watched gleaming rows of B-17s lift into the dawn, and every evening counted the holes in the sky where they were supposed to return. Over Bremen, over Regensburg, over Schweinfurt, the same story replayed. The Luftwaffe had learned the B-17's anatomy like hunters studying prey. They knew its strengths: rugged wings, redundant systems, 4 reliable Wright Cyclone engines. And they knew its fatal flaw: the underside. The flying fortress was built around the idea that defensive firepower could replace armor. It carried up to 1350 caliber machine guns, but only a thin skin of aluminum to keep the weight down. The lower fuselage, especially between the bomb bay and the tail, was a soft target. One cannon shell through the floor could shatter the control cables or kill everyone in the waist section. German fighters exploited it mercilessly. FW-190s dove from below, spraying 20mm shells upward into the bellies of the bombers. Me-109s followed with head-on passes, cutting through formation gaps and forcing gunners to pivot frantically while blind to the attacks beneath them. At Thorpe Abbotts and every other base across East Anglia, the math of attrition was brutal. A full bomber group could lose 10 out of 20 planes in a single raid. Casualties ran higher than infantry divisions. And the worst part was how predictable it all became. Crews even gave the unarmored lower hull a nickname: the coffin plate. Mechanics watched this cycle in silence. They patched holes, counted bullet paths, and saw the patterns the engineers never did. The hits always landed in the same places: beneath the waist gun, near the radio operator's station, across the bomb bay doors. Each impact told the same story in steel: too thin, too exposed, too fragile. By autumn, the 8th Air Force knew it couldn't keep this up. The statistics were turning suicidal. The average crew life expectancy over Germany was 11 missions. A full tour required 25. That meant most men never made it halfway. But there was no choice. Factories kept building. Planners kept ordering raids. And Keller kept watching fresh bombers roll in as burnt ones rolled out. Replacement parts were scarce. Armor plates were prioritized for tanks, not aircraft. Commanders insisted that bombers could take it. They were wrong. The factories back home had engineered efficiency. But the war over Europe demanded endurance. In that gap, between how machines were built and how they were dying, men like Keller began to improvise. He wasn't alone. Across England, ground crews started bolting scrap steel to the bellies of returning aircraft, welding spare engine cowlings under gun positions, even melting down shell casings to reinforce turrets. Most of it was unofficial. All of it was desperate. But Keller took it further. He had seen enough of what cannon fire did to living men, enough funerals wrapped in flags. He decided that if the B-17 wouldn't protect its crew, then the crew chief would. He started scavenging steel wherever he could find it. from crashed trucks, destroyed hangars, even the doors of bomb carts. It wasn't armor by design. It was armor by defiance. Because 1943 had made one thing clear: perfection was losing. Improvisation might just survive. And on one cold November night, under blackout lights and falling snow, Keller began his forbidden project, the birth of the Iron Belle. In every war room, generals love numbers: kill ratios, bomb tonnage, sorties flown. But the numbers that haunted the airfields weren't the ones on chalkboards. They were the ones burned into the morning reports. Missing 5 aircraft, 51 men, estimated lost over target. By the fall of 1943, those numbers had stopped shocking anyone. 26,000 American bomber crewmen would die over Europe before the war was over. That's nearly half the strength of the 8th Air Force. In some squadrons, the average life expectancy for a crew was 11 missions, less than 3 weeks of flying. Over 30% of bombers returning from Germany came back with battle damage, many barely holding together. A single raid could cost the U.S. 60 planes, $5 million in hardware, and 600 men. The Air Force called it sustainable loss. The men on the flight line called it slow suicide. When the statistics reached Thorpe Abbott's, they arrived stamped and typed. But to Ray Keller, every digit was a man whose hand he'd shaken. Every percentage point was a face that wouldn't come back from the sky. He kept his own numbers, scratched into the inside of his toolbox lid in pencil. He counted hits on the returning aircraft, traced the clusters where German cannon fire always struck. After 20 raids, his list told a story more honest than any headquarters report. 63% of hits landed below the waistline. 40% penetrated the floor near the ammo belts. 15% entered through the thin radio compartment walls. 0 hits on the top armor plates the factory had insisted were essential. It was math that screamed common sense, and command ignored it. Every pound of armor meant less range, fewer bombs, less fuel. The engineers had built the B-17 to balance protection with payload, trusting that formation flying would shield each plane's weaknesses. But over Bremen there was no formation. There was only chaos. Screaming engines, black smoke, and sky full of shrapnel. The official doctrine said, the fortress protects itself. The reality said, it bleeds from the bottom. Keller did the math. Each extra pound of armor reduced range by about 1 mile. But every hit avoided meant 10 lives saved. If he added even 1,200 pounds of field armor, the plane would burn a few more gallons per hour, but it might finally make it home. When he brought the numbers to the engineering officer, the man laughed. If we let every mechanic redesign planes, we'd have flying junkyards. Keller stared him down. Then maybe the junkyards will survive longer than your factories. The officer walked away. The math stayed. Because deep down, everyone on the ground knew the truth. The system valued efficiency over existence. The air war had turned men into equations: fuel ratios, damage tolerance, acceptable losses. But to Keller, the equation was simple. If perfection kills, imperfection saves. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing probability. The numbers had proven one thing beyond doubt. No matter how beautiful the engineering, a dead plane can't deliver a payload. So he decided to build ugly. To weld where they said don't. To add weight where the charts said no. Because the statistics didn't lie, and the math of attrition demanded one thing above all else. Survival had to be heavier than hope. And that's exactly what he was about to build. The first sheet Keller cut came from a wrecked Bedford truck sitting behind the hangar. The vehicle had been shredded by shrapnel weeks earlier, its doors hanging open like torn paper. He ran his hand along the dented steel, testing its thickness with his knuckles. It wasn't aircraft grade, but it was dense, and dense was what kept men alive. He dragged out the acetylene torch, rigged to a stolen oxygen tank from the base infirmary. Sparks spat against the cold night air as he sliced the truck's panels into rough, uneven squares. Each piece weighed nearly 20 pounds, far more than the manuals allowed for structural modification. But Keller wasn't thinking in manuals anymore. By midnight, the hangar smelled of scorched metal and sweat. His assistant, Corporal Lewis, held the panels steady as Keller welded. "Sir, if the brass finds out—" "They won't," Keller said. "And if they do, I'll weld their Jeep doors shut next." They started with the belly, the coffin plate. Keller riveted 2 steel panels across the bomb bay floor, then added a third overlapping section near the waist gun positions. He reinforced the mounts using scavenged struts from a crashed P-47's landing gear, hammering each into shape with the butt of a wrench. When they ran out of rivets, they melted old shell casings into crude fasteners. By dawn, the bomber's silhouette had changed. The underbelly bulged with rough seams, streaked black from welding smoke. It looked primitive, almost medieval. The other mechanics laughed. "You're turning her into a flying anvil." Keller didn't smile. "Good. Maybe anvils don't die so easy." Over the next day, he scavenged more material. A boiler door from a bombed-out warehouse, a sheet of corrugated steel from a supply crate, even the armored backplate from a destroyed half-track. Piece by piece, the armor took shape. Crude belly plates, reinforced ammo chutes, welded side ribs protecting the gunner's position. By the third night, the Iron Belle was nearly 1,000 pounds heavier. The added weight strained the jacks, forced them to prop the tail up with oil drums. When the test pilot came by to inspect the modifications, his first words were, "You realize this bird won't get off the ground, right?" Keller tossed him a rag. "Then you'll prove me wrong." During the first test run, the engines roared unevenly. The tail sagged, the tires groaned, but the plane rolled down the strip and lifted, barely. Everyone held their breath as the bomber clawed into the air, slow, lumbering, heavy with defiance. It wasn't graceful, but it was airborne. When she landed, the pilot climbed out, wide-eyed and pale. "She flies," he said. "Feels like dragging a barn through the sky, but she flies." Keller exhaled for the first time in hours. "That's good enough," he said. "They'll shoot barns, too." A few days later, Iron Belle joined a routine mission over Bremen. The air was full of flak, the sky burning black. German FW-190s dove from below, cannons blazing. Keller listened over the radio as the crew reported damage, shells slamming into the belly. But each time, the gunner's voice came back steady. "Armor's holding. No breaches." 17 hits. None penetrated. When the Iron Belle landed, her steel plates were dented, scorched, and nearly torn loose, but intact. Inside, the crew was laughing through exhaustion. The waist gunner kissed the floor. "That ugly bastard saved us." Keller wiped his hands on a rag, eyes tracing the bullet marks burned deep into the plates. "She's not pretty," he said quietly, "but neither's survival." The other crews stared, half in disbelief, half in envy. One of them asked, "You think she'll fly again?" Keller didn't hesitate. "She hasn't finished what she started." That night, under blackout lights, he began cutting more steel. The war wouldn't wait, and now neither would he. When the first combat report from the Iron Belle landed on the commander's desk, it didn't read like a miracle. It read like a problem. The plane had survived, yes, but at a cost that defied every line of engineering logic. She'd burned an extra 220 gallons of fuel per mission, lost 12% of her climb rate, and lumbered like a barge in the sky. On paper, it was a nightmare. In the air, it was salvation. That contradiction was the new math of survival. Every rule of aerodynamics said Keller's bomber should have failed. 1,000 pounds of improvised armor threw off the balance, stressed the wings, and shortened the range. The B-17's wings weren't built for the weight of scrap steel, truck doors, and boiler plates. They flexed at takeoff, groaned on turns, and forced the pilots to baby the throttle just to keep her steady. But the armor had rewritten the physics of fear. Where the Luftwaffe expected weakness, they found defiance. German cannon shells hit with the force of sledgehammers, each 20mm round traveling at 2,700 feet per second, capable of ripping through half an inch of aircraft skin. But Keller's patchwork armor spread the energy outward, turning perfect penetration into harmless dents. It didn't stop the impacts. It absorbed them. The math became visible after the second raid. The Iron Belle came home with 17 holes in her armor, 0 in the crew. A sister ship, same squadron, unmodified, took 5 hits and never returned. The numbers spoke louder than regulations. Weight increased by 7%. Fuel efficiency dropped by 9%. Crew survival rate jumped 400%, and that ratio broke the logic of logistics. Command still hated it. The base engineers ran the numbers again, hoping to prove it a fluke. They blamed luck, favorable weather, even faulty German fuses. But luck doesn't weld steel. Luck doesn't stop cannon shells at 20,000 feet. The men in the air knew better. They'd seen how flak chewed aluminum like paper. They'd seen how standard bombers turned into falling coffins when a single 20mm burst hit the waist. They called the Iron Belle slow, clumsy, and ugly. But they also called her immortal. Keller's armor hadn't just changed a plane, it had changed a rhythm. Before, every sortie felt like gambling with dice loaded against them. Now there was something tangible between death and hope, something a man could touch, hammer, and weld. The bomber's weight no longer symbolized inefficiency. It symbolized endurance. In the mess hall, the pilots started joking that Keller's junkyard engineering was heavier than headquarters brains. Someone painted a slogan under the Iron Belle's nose art: "If it flies, it survives." But beneath the humor was revelation. The physics of war had shifted. Perfection was fragile. Imperfection, properly applied, was indestructible. Keller hadn't broken the math. He'd bent it. He'd traded speed for survival, elegance for endurance, and found that the cost was worth paying. Each pound of steel meant minutes more in the sky. Each minute more meant another bomber making it home. That was the hidden calculus the engineers had missed. War wasn't a contest of performance. It was a contest of persistence. And persistence always weighed more than perfection. By the time the Iron Belle finished her third mission, even the skeptics began to understand. The heavier she got, the more confidence her crew carried. They didn't care if she flew slower. They cared that she came back. The math had been rewritten in flame and rivets. Weight equals life. And for the first time since 1943, the bombers of Thorpe Abbotts began returning with more men alive than dead. Keller had done the impossible. He had broken the physics of fear. The Iron Belle's real trial came over Bremen. It was March 6, 1944. A cold, gray morning that looked like every other, except this time the Luftwaffe was waiting. Radar picked up fighters gathering north of the target. FW-190s and Me-109s stacked in layers, circling like hawks. The crews called it the meat grinder. In the belly of the Iron Belle, Sergeant Paul Dugan, the waist gunner, checked his belts of ammunition. He patted the steel panels Keller had welded beneath his feet. Ugly seams, hammer dents, scorched edges. He whispered, "You better hold, old girl." At 22,000 feet, the formation reached the city. The sky turned black with flak, hundreds of shells bursting like thunder. The Iron Belle jolted as fragments slammed into her sides. Her pilot, Captain Bill Carr, shouted over the intercom, "Stay tight! Stay tight!" The entire left wing shuddered. Then the fighters hit. FW-190s dove from below, cannon fire flashing bright as welding arcs. One shell struck the Iron Belle dead center under the bomb bay, a hit that would have gutted any normal fortress. Instead, it exploded outward in sparks, leaving a cratered dent. Dugan looked down, expecting daylight, saw only smoke and steel. "It held!" he screamed. The next burst tore across the waist section. Tracers punched through the windows, one slug ripping into the new plating. Dugan felt the shockwave under his boots, but stayed standing. He swung his twin 50s and fired, sweeping the arc as the fighters pulled up. One enemy caught fire, spiraling out of the cloud layer, trailing black smoke. "Confirmed one!" Dugan yelled. The intercom hissed. The tail gunner's voice came through, ragged. "We're hit again. Armor's dented, but we're still sealed." The pilot looked back over his shoulder. The interior was glowing red from friction and heat, the plates radiating warmth through the thin floor. "Keller, you mad bastard," he muttered. "You built us a tank." For 10 minutes, the Iron Belle absorbed punishment. Shells pounded the belly. Holes blossomed across the sides, but nothing broke. Other B-17s around them weren't so lucky. One caught a direct hit and split apart mid-air. Another went down in flames, its bomb bay opening like a wound. The Belle stayed in formation, engines howling, metal screaming. The crew could feel the weight of the armor holding them together. Even when hydraulic fluid sprayed into the compartment, even when the oxygen masks froze from altitude, the steel beneath their feet stayed solid. "Bombs away!" the bombardier shouted. The bay doors opened sluggishly. The hinges warped from the impact, but the payload fell clean. 2,000 pounds of ordnance vanished into the clouds below. Seconds later, explosions flared across Bremen's industrial district. Then came the order, "Turn for home." On the way back, silence filled the intercom. No one spoke until they crossed the channel. Then the pilot's voice cracked through the static. "We're bringing her in. She's ugly, she's heavy, and she's home." When the Iron Belle touched down, half the base was waiting. The belly plating was dented inward, scorched black, and peppered with fragments. But it hadn't failed. 17 impacts, 0 fatalities. Keller climbed up the ladder, still in his grease-stained coveralls, and ran his hand along the damaged plates. He could feel the heat still radiating through them. "She bled," he said softly, "but she didn't break." The base photographer took pictures. One of them later circulated among ground crews under the caption, "Homemade armor approved by survival." The brass didn't comment. They didn't have to. Every mechanic who saw those photos knew exactly what it meant. Keller had done what the factories couldn't. He'd built courage into steel. And somewhere over Bremen, the Luftwaffe learned something new too. The flying fortress had found its teeth. By the time the Iron Belle flew her 7th mission, she was a legend painted in soot and blood. Her skin was more patchwork than aluminum, rough, burned, scarred from 5 weeks of constant combat. The crews said she smelled like oil and gunpowder, the scent of something that refused to die. April 11, 1944. Target, Leipzig. The Luftwaffe had regrouped, leaner but meaner, with new tactics. Instead of head-on assaults, the German fighters began flanking from the sides, firing rockets before diving below to rake the bombers' bellies. They'd learned that the Iron Belle existed, and they wanted to test whether the myth could bleed. Inside, the crew was quiet. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Fields, had taped a photo of Keller to the inside of his turret. "For luck," he said. At 24,000 feet, the sun flashed off contrails. The first wave of FW-190s came in low and fast. They fired 20mm rounds straight into the formation. The sky lit up in arcs of fire. The Iron Belle took the hits first. 3 direct impacts across the armor plates. A cannon shell ripped through the tail section and punched the edge of Keller's welded plate. It tore a crater the size of a fist, but didn't penetrate. The shock threw Fields against his turret glass. "Still sealed!" he shouted. Captain Carr leveled the plane, holding formation through turbulence. "How's the belly?" "Hot, but holding," Dugan replied. The plating glowed orange. Smoke leaked from between weld seams, but the structure remained intact. The sound was horrifying, a metal shrieking against heat and pressure way. But the Iron Belle refused to fall apart. Another burst hit the side window, shattering the glass. The co-pilot ducked as shards flew across the cockpit. Oxygen hissed from a ruptured line. The pilot cursed, switching to emergency air. They're pouring fire into us. And yet, through the chaos, the bomber didn't falter. The armor absorbed hit after hit, deforming like clay, dispersing energy instead of breaking. The crew felt the impacts through the floor, dull, bone-deep vibrations. But the gunner kept firing, his twin Brownings sweeping arcs of red tracers. One enemy fighter disintegrated in midair, its wing sheared clean off. "Another down!" Fields shouted. The Belle's right engine sputtered. Flames licked from the cowling. The pilot cut fuel flow and feathered the prop. "We're running on 3!" But she kept flying. When they reached the target zone, the bombardier toggled the payload. Bombs fell clean through the smoke. Seconds later, explosions rippled across the city below. The air vibrated from the force, a man-made thunder rolling beneath their crippled wings. Turning home was agony. The Belle limped out of formation, losing altitude. German fighters circled, smelling blood. Carr gritted his teeth. "Keep her straight, boys. The armor bought us minutes. Make them count." 2 Me-109s dove in for the kill. Dugan fired until his barrels glowed white. One fighter erupted in flames, the other overshot, clipped by debris, spiraling out of control. The sky cleared. Silence returned, the eerie, fragile kind that only came after surviving hell. When the Iron Belle reached England, her landing gear refused to lower. The hydraulic lines were shredded. Keller's field reinforcement around the bomb bay had jammed the pressure system. Carr didn't wait. He called in, "Gear failure. Attempting belly landing." They came in low, skidding across the wet runway. Sparks screamed beneath them as the improvised armor ground against concrete. The plane slowed, groaning, and came to rest in a plume of smoke. No explosion. No fire. Every man climbed out alive. Keller ran across the field, shouting through the haze. When he reached the bomber, he dropped to his knees beside the plates he'd welded months before. They were glowing faintly, warped beyond use, but still whole. Dugan limped over, grinning through blood. "Guess your junkyard armor worked, Chief?" Keller touched the steel, still hot enough to burn. "Guess it did," he said softly. The Belle never flew again. She was too damaged, too heavy, too full of history. But her remains were stripped and studied. Word spread up the chain of command. Within months, official designs began adding reinforced belly armor and internal plating. Changes born not from factories, but from a field mechanic with a torch. And though she never took off again, the Iron Belle had already done the impossible. She proved that courage could be welded. After the 7th mission, the Iron Belle sat in the hangar like a monument to defiance. The plates Keller had welded were twisted and burnt, seams cracked from the stress of flight, but every dent was a medal of survival. Mechanics from neighboring bases came to see her in silence, running their hands over the jagged welds and blackened rivets. The bomber looked like a scrapyard miracle. And that was exactly what she was. The engineers from headquarters arrived next, armed with clipboards and suspicion. They measured the plates, weighed the structure, and photographed every modification. One of them muttered, "This isn't engineering, it's vandalism." Keller wiped his hands on a rag and said, "Vandalism that brought 7 crews home." They couldn't argue with that. When they ran the data, the numbers forced respect. Out of 7 missions, the Iron Belle had taken 53 recorded hits from 20mm shells, survived every one, and returned all her crews. Her kill count stood at 6 enemy aircraft destroyed. Operational survival, 100%. The bomber's armor had violated weight limits, safety guidelines, and structural equations, but it had rewritten the logic of survival. Every extra pound of steel had turned probability into possibility. Command never gave Keller public credit. They couldn't. Admitting a field mechanic had out-engineered Boeing would have been political suicide. Instead, they sent an internal memo to Wright Field labeled Experimental Field Armor Analysis. Inside were sketches of Keller's modifications, rephrased in engineering language. The memo concluded, "Unofficial armor applications have demonstrated positive effects on crew survivability. Further study recommended. In other words, steal his work, silence his name. But that didn't matter to Keller. Recognition wasn't the point. Every plate he welded had carried men through fire and brought them home. That was worth more than medals or memos. Around the airfield, the crews began calling him Ironhand. When new bombers arrived fresh from the States, pilots would ask, "Can Ironhand take a look at her belly before we fly?" His shop became an assembly line of rebellion. Saws, welders, and torches working through the night, turning perfection into protection. The impact spread far beyond one hangar. Within weeks, other bases started field armoring their bombers using scrap from trucks, tanks, even kitchen stoves. By summer, the unofficial practice was everywhere. The Air Force had created a doctrine without realizing it. Improvisation saves lives. The myth of factory perfection was over. The war had proven that innovation didn't belong to laboratories, but to those standing knee-deep in oil and dirt, solving problems before dawn. In the math of survival, Keller's armor had changed everything. He'd taken the weakest part of the B-17, the paper-thin belly, and turned it into a fortress. He'd shown that the margin between life and death wasn't written in blueprints. It was written in courage. Years later, when a historian asked one of the surviving pilots how he felt about flying the Iron Belle, the man said, "It was like flying inside someone's willpower." That's what Keller had built, a machine of willpower. Not efficient, not elegant, not approved, but immortal. The war would move on, new bombers would come, but every piece of armor that saved a life afterward owed a debt to the man who broke the rules first. Keller never called it genius. He called it stubbornness. "You build with what you have," he'd say. "And if what you have is junk, then make junk tougher than fear." Because in the end, war isn't won by perfect machines. It's won by imperfect men who refuse to stop fixing them. And the Iron Belle, ugly, heavy, and impossible, had become the proof. When the war finally ended, the Iron Belle was towed to the edge of the field and left beneath a canvas tarp. The men who'd flown her scattered back home, farmers, students, sons who had seen too much sky. Her armor, blackened and pitted, was scheduled for removal and study. But Keller didn't stay to watch. He packed his tools into a wooden crate, wiped his hands one last time on a rag that smelled of oil and gunpowder, and walked away before the scrappers came. They never wrote his name into the technical manuals. The reports listed him as T. Sergeant R. Keller, unauthorized modification. But the weld seams on that battered B-17 said otherwise. They told a story in steel that outlived the signatures of generals and engineers. After the war, Keller went home to Ohio. He opened a repair shop off Highway 30, fixing tractors and trucks with the same stubborn patience he'd once used to hold a bomber together with scrap metal. A few veterans who passed through the area stopped by to shake his hand. They'd heard the stories. The mad mechanic who made armor out of truck doors and turned a bomber into a tank. Keller always smiled and changed the subject. "Wasn't me," he'd say. "Just a man with a welder and bad ideas." But the legend didn't fade. In 1946, Boeing engineers examined what was left of the Iron Belle. They found Keller's field plates had distributed impact energy better than any factory-installed armor. The internal report quietly recommended similar reinforcement for future models, the B-29 Superfortress among them. Officially, it was independent research. Unofficially, it was the legacy of one man with a torch. When the Air Force later introduced modular armor kits for heavy bombers, some of the blueprints matched Keller's layout exactly. Overlapping plates, flexible joints, reinforced waist beams. The field-borne fix had become doctrine. He never knew it. Keller died in 1962, heart failure at his workbench, a wrench still in his hand. At his funeral, a few local veterans brought a small plaque, handmade, like everything he ever trusted. It read, "Ironhand, builder of things that should not have flown, but did. No medals, no parades. Just the sound of wind over the fields, like the low hum of engines far away." The Iron Belle didn't survive the scrapyard. Her steel was melted down, repurposed for civilian aircraft frames. But in every bomber that took off after her, in every plane that came home battered but intact, there was a little of her defiance, a little of Keller's courage welded into the bones. Because war always forgets its inventors. The headlines remember the pilots, the generals, the victories. But the world they flew through was built by men who refused to let machines die quietly. That's what Keller proved, that salvation doesn't come from blueprints or orders, but from hands willing to burn for an idea. He didn't outthink Boeing. He outlived it. And somewhere, high above a sky that once ate men alive, the ghosts of the bombers still fly, each one carrying the echo of a wrench hitting steel, and the memory of a mechanic who made armor out of nothing but courage, because perfection may win awards, but it's defiance that keeps the world flying.